repercussion on the German economy, on the European Union economy. So generally, that's one of my duties, but some of the other duties I do include being the first point of contact for German companies that want to come to Kenya, because there are so many European companies from time to time who want to set up shop in Kenya. And one of the things that makes Kenya really attractive in the eastern coast of Africa is because Kenya is a gateway or a regional hub. So I don't know, maybe in part of your studies, you guys know about the regional economic communities in Africa. So in East Africa, you have the East African Community, the EAC, which will be like a version of the European Union on the African continent. But it's much smaller. And in West Africa, for instance, you have the ECOWAS, Economic Community for West Africa. In Southern Africa, you have SADC. And in Northern Africa, you also have like the Maghreb. And so Kenya is the regional hub in East Africa. And in the East African community, Kenya is the largest economy. And something also interesting to note, Kenya is the only lower middle income country in the EAC region. So the EAC, the East African community, is made up of 7 countries at the moment. And all the other countries are least developed countries, the so-called LDCs. And Kenya moved one step up to the lower middle income country. So it's a middle income country, but on the lower end. And that was back in 2014, so almost 10 years ago. I think to be precise, 9 years ago. So it makes Kenya really attractive because it's the largest economy in the region, and it's also a regional hub. And consequently, so many companies that want to come and join the East African community, they might be targeting a country like Rwanda. They want to go and do business in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, or Tanzania. When they want to set up shop, they might think, let's go to Kenya because it's the biggest economy. And even if we don't get enough trade, enough business in Kenya, we'll simply use Kenya as the hub, and then we will have our regional office in Kenya, and then we can try and join the other countries that are close to Kenya. So Kenya is a regional hub, but Kenya is also a diplomatic hub. Probably if maybe you guys have come across it in your I don't know, social studies or your history lessons. Kenya is Nairobi is the host city for United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP. And UNEP is the only UN agency located on the Southern Hemisphere. And of course, Southern Hemisphere also includes part of Australia, for instance, or Central America. But the only UN office on the Southern Hemisphere is in Nairobi, Kenya. So the presence of the UN, especially UNEP, has also brought the other UN agencies. So like I think the UN also has their regional African office, the main UN office also in Nairobi, and agencies such as the UN Habitat, and I also think UNODC, they all have branches in Nairobi. So that has also made Nairobi to become a diplomatic hub. And the European Union also has their main delegation is also, the regional delegation is also based in Nairobi. And consequently, international organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF, especially the IFC, International Finance Corporation, the World Bank, they all have their regional offices in Nairobi. So it has made Nairobi a regional hub in diplomatic terms, but also in economic terms. So many multinationals come to Nairobi to set up, and then they extend their businesses across the region. Maybe a little bit of introduction, just a general overview of how can I say it, the basic statistics about Kenya. So Kenya is a country, received independence in 1964. The current population is about 56 million people. So you guys are studying in Spain. Spain is, I think, 48 million people. So it's almost on the same level in terms of population with Kenya. And of course, a country, I think, like France, UK, Italy, they are somewhere between 60 and 64 million people. So it's almost, in terms of population, it's almost on the same league. Kenya is also, let's say until 2023, Kenya is the third largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa after Nigeria and South Africa. But these will unfortunately change. At the beginning of the year, IMF did some of their forecasts, and in their forecast, they said Kenya will lose the third position and will fall back to fifth. And Ethiopia and Angola, which were previously, before 2019, Ethiopia and Angola were ahead of Kenya. So they are going to jump back into position 3 and 4. And probably, so the official statistics from January 2024, Kenya will be the fifth largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa. And so currently it's the third largest in sub-Saharan Africa, but if you include the Northern African countries, Egypt, Algeria, and Morocco, then and Tunisia, then Kenya is number 6, the sixth largest economy in Africa. And what other, maybe some of the other basic statistics? Yeah, so those are some of the basic statistics about Kenya as a country. And of course, it's located in East Africa, the Horn of Africa. It is a member of not only the East African community, which I said is a regional economic community, almost similar to the European Union, but of course the European Union is at a much higher level of integration. Because the East African community is made up of a free trade area, common market, customs union, and there are certain basic steps of having a political union. So the East African community, for instance, has a East African assembly, and members of the assembly are always elected every 2-3 years or something of the sort. So we have something like a small European parliament also. It's based in Arusha, which is in Tanzania, but it's closer to the border with Kenya. So Arusha is actually the capital of the East African community, pretty much the same way Brussels is the capital of the European Union. And Kenya is also a member of other regional communities, but mostly common markets and customs unions. So there's one called COMESA, which is a very huge one on the African continent. It starts all the way from Egypt at the top, and it ends in South Africa. And I think it has almost 20 countries who are members of COMESA. Kenya is also a member of a regional group in the Horn of Africa. So Horn of Africa includes the EAC, but it also includes Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Sudan, and Somalia. And the IGAD is mostly concerned, it's called the Intergovernmental Authority on Development and Security. So it mostly concerns development and security, because the Horn of Africa is also an area that has faced so many security challenges over the years. I don't know how old you guys were back in 2012. Between 2010 and 2012, probably you are still in primary school. There were lots of issues regarding piracy along the coast of Somalia and Kenya. And there were like the modern day pirates who would hijack large ships, and then they will hold people ransom, and once they were given money, they will take the money. So piracy and also terrorism, there's a group called Al-Shabaab, which has committed a lot of terror attacks in the region. So Kenya is also a member of that organization. And yeah, I think those are the basic stats about Kenya and maybe about the East African region. So before I move into the general situation of the country, I don't know if maybe anybody has a question.
If anyone has questions. Yeah, Ilya, go ahead.
Hello. I monitored the currency of Kenya, which is the Kenyan shilling, and I would like to ask you, why is it so stable? Like the graph doesn't move anywhere; it's like super stable. Could you please explain that, or if you know the answer?
Okay, that's really interesting, because I think I was going to touch about it in the macroeconomic situation. So actually, what has been happening in the last, let's say, what has been happening in the last, how can I say it, in the last 1 year or 1.5 years, is that the Kenyan shilling has actually been strongly depreciating. So, for instance, I think it has lost its value by almost 30%. And before that, like I think over the past decade or so, the currency was really stable. So maybe whatever you are referring to, I don't know, did you check the year? Because most likely it's something that was before 2022. And what has been happening like over the last 1.5 years or so, you guys probably already know, like the war in Ukraine, and also the inflation that came out of the war in Ukraine, and the US Federal Reserve, but also the European Central Bank, the ECB, they started raising their benchmark interest rates. And this has really affected many countries on the African continent, because so many countries use the dollar as for trade, but also as forex reserves. And one of the impact of raising benchmark interest rates, especially in the West, especially in the US and in Europe, is that so many foreign investors, even from the Northern Hemisphere, who have invested in Kenya, and let's say the stock markets, they decide to withdraw their money and take it to much more safe havens. Because anytime there are conflicts, there are situations, I mean, even currently, like with the situation in Israel, investors always do the same thing. They say putting our money in the Kenyan stock market is a little bit risky, because if for instance, the conflict in Israel and Palestine, if it expands, then it will mean that maybe the oil prices will really go up, and countries which are developing countries like Kenya will struggle much more. And so they always decide, let's go park our money in US Treasury bills or in European bonds, and they always take the money out. And so like it really hurts the strength of the shilling, as well as many currencies on the African continent. So I'm just assuming maybe whatever the graph, when you're checking the graph of the Kenyan shilling, maybe it's something you checked probably before January 2022, because currently the situation is a little bit different.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, welcome.
Elena, you can ask your question now.
Okay. Hi. So my
Hi.
question is, what's the Kenyan natives like view of so much like foreign movement in Nairobi?
Foreign movement, meaning travel of foreigners, or?
Yeah, like the package, like businesses especially, which like foreign businesses establishing in like Nairobi and like Kenya. If you want to talk Kenya as general, that would also like include my question.
Okay, so I think you're referring to foreigners who come to invest in Kenya and open different kinds of businesses. If that's what you are alluding to, then there are so many different kinds of businesses that have set up shop in Nairobi and in Kenya, and which are run by foreigners. I mean, the quickest one that will come to mind are startups. So Kenya, and especially Nairobi, is known as the Silicon Savannah. So it's a wordplay on Silicon Valley in the US. And Kenya has one of the, I think the fourth largest and most vibrant startup ecosystem on the African continent, after South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria. Kenya is the fourth, and it also attracts a lot of venture capital and investment. And the startups are in different things. It could be retail, it could be logistics. There are some in fintech, financial technology. And Kenya is also home of the so-called M-Pesa, which is a mobile banking payment system. And it was invented in Kenya, I think, back in 2006. And so currently it's in a number of countries in Africa, whereby you simply pay with your phone. Like you get a message, you simply pay with your phone using sort of like an app. So I think a year or two ago, an app in the US became quite popular. It's called Cash App or something. So we've had something of the sort for like the last 15 years. But in the US, people are like, oh, this is such a great invention, etc. And I mean, it has already been in use in Kenya for a very long time. Foreigners do invest in different kinds of businesses. So you have like the classic ones, companies that come and do manufacturing, they do healthcare, They do travel, tours and travel. They do insurance, banking, etc. But you also have companies that simply come to open up shop, let's say in the retail sector, in fashion industry. I know so many European chains. How could I call them? Like Woolworths, for instance. I don't know if we have Zara in Nairobi, but in certain malls, because there are so many multinational malls in Nairobi, you have people stocking, having all kinds of businesses. Restaurants, you have hotels, especially the hotel industry, and so many of them, and many of them are also in Nairobi, but Kenya is also a largely tourist country. Like we have major national parks. And one maybe thing I forgot to mention at the beginning, Nairobi is the only capital city with a national park in its environs in the entire world. So there's no any other city in the world that has a national park domiciled right within the capital city. So national parks, we have the Masai Mara, and we also have the Serengeti, and it's called the eighth wonder of the world, when the wildebeests, I don't know if you guys know wildebeests, they migrate from Masai Mara in Kenya, they cross over to the Tanzanian side in Serengeti, and it was declared by UNESCO to be eighth wonder of the world, I think back in 2008 or 2010. So generally, foreigners, there are so many kinds of businesses that exist in Nairobi. And maybe just one which is quite popular, but I don't think only in Nairobi, in Kenya, but in so many countries, even maybe in Barcelona, is the gastronomy sector. So like restaurants and bars, because as you guys probably already know, like I think Barcelona is a very cosmopolitan city. If you have Mexicans, a number of Mexicans who live in Barcelona, then chances are you will have a Mexican restaurant somewhere. If you have a sizable population of Chinese people in Barcelona, you will have Chinese restaurants. So it's almost the same in Nairobi. You have Lebanese restaurants, you have Chinese restaurants, you have Japanese, Korean, you have even Brazilian restaurants. Like it's really a cosmopolitan area and industry of sorts. And because earlier mentioned that Nairobi is a diplomatic capital, and also the economic is a diplomatic hub in the region, and also an economic hub. So there are so many multinational companies, which means there are so many foreigners in Nairobi, and that makes Nairobi probably as much diverse as, I don't know, Berlin, as London, as Barcelona, Madrid, I don't know. But of course not on the same level. But Nairobi is a city of about 5 million people, and the people who come in to work, the total number goes about 1 more million, so it comes to about 6 million people, even though 1 million always leave in the evening to go back to the surrounding cities not far from Nairobi. Yes.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I've got a question, but I think I'm going to ask it later, so we can just continue with your presentation, and we'll ask more questions after.
Okay. Okay, so the next point I wanted to talk about, which is really important in Kenya, is the debt situation in the country. So Kenya is one of the countries on the African continent that are currently labeled as being under debt distress. So debt distress means you are struggling to pay your debts. And this particular situation is affecting so many countries on the African continent. I think by the latest numbers I read, about 21 countries out of the 53 countries on the African continent are in debt distress. And there have been so many discussions on how to try and solve that situation. One statistic that might be interesting to you guys is that so many countries on the African continent are spending almost 1/3 of their budgets to pay debts. And these debts are local debts, but also international debts. So you are talking about multilateral debts from the IMF, the World Bank, and maybe the African Development Bank. But you're also talking about commercial debts, which are some of the most tough ones. There are these ones called the Eurobonds. Eurobonds are debts by commercial banks, the huge commercial banks, HSBC, Standard Chartered, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs. And most of them for Kenya, I think Kenya has 6 Eurobonds that have been issued over the past decade. And most of them have been issued out in London. And one of the Eurobonds, a 10-year paper, is maturing next year in June, and it's a $2 billion Eurobond, which Kenya has to pay. And that already kind of underlines how many, the situation in which so many African countries find themselves under. Like a third of their budget is basically going towards paying debt, meaning only two-thirds of the budget will be going towards government programs, healthcare, education, and all that. And in most countries, there is already a statistic that countries are spending more to pay their debts than they are spending in the education sector and in the healthcare sector combined. So debt distress is a huge issue in Kenya. And maybe I don't know how much you guys have studied in your history lessons or social studies. China has become a really huge player in Africa over the last decade, and Kenya was one of the flagship. I'm just assuming you guys know something called the Belt and Road Initiative. There was even a summit, I think, just last week in China. They were celebrating 10 years, they were marking 10 years of the Belt and Road Initiative. And Kenya was one of the key countries in Africa. So the Chinese government helped Kenya to build a standard gauge railway because Kenya's railway was built in colonial times. I think it was laid out in the early 1900s. And since independence, it had never been changed. So it was so rusty and slow and everything. And the Chinese gave Kenya a loan in 2014, and the standard gauge railway was built by 2017. It was already ready, so in 2018 it started operations. So Kenya has to start paying those bills because you only receive like a grace period for like the Chinese loans. I think it's 5 years. For the Eurobond, sometimes it's a 10-year paper. So Kenya already has started paying the Chinese loan back. And in next year, Kenya is going to continue to pay the Chinese loan, but also the Eurobond, which is maturing, the $2 billion paper. And so all these things are making Kenya become really squeezed in terms of having the fiscal capacity or room. And for that reason, Kenya is currently actually under an IMF program, which started during the COVID pandemic. So IMF comes into a country, gives you a 3-year program, but they come with so many conditions and you have to fulfill the conditions, and they always review the conditions every year. So like a 3-year IMF program means they only give you the first installment for the first year, and after the first year has ended, they come and review and say, hey, you are supposed to make these reforms, do this and that and that, and then they give you the next money. So Kenya has been under a program for the last 3 years, and it is going to be extended for the next 2 years because currently, in November, there'll be another IMF mission coming to the country, and 2 countries have already defaulted in Africa. Zambia was the first one to default in 2020, and last year in December, Ghana also defaulted, so they can't pay back their debts. So they have to restructure their debts because you have to still pay back your debts. So there were some worries that there's a possibility that Kenya might also default, even though the Kenyan government is saying, no, we are strong enough, we will be able to pay our debts and all that. And it's also interesting because Kenya's debt distress is slightly different from many other countries on the African continent. The situation in Kenya, like the debt, one of the metrics that is always used to measure how much debt a country has is the debt to GDP ratio. And in Kenya, the debt to GDP ratio is about 67-68%. In many other African countries, it's 75, 80, 85%. But the difference with Kenya is that Kenya has a lot of commercial debts from commercial banks. So like the Eurobonds I was mentioning. And many of the other countries, they have a lot of debt, but it's mostly multilateral. And multilateral from the IMF and the World Bank, they have very, how can I say it, concessional conditions. So like you pay a very small amount of interest, and it takes, you get a 10-year grace period, and then maybe you have 30 to 40 years to pay it back. If you compare that with the commercial Eurobonds, you have maybe Eurobonds that have to be paid in 5 years, some in 10 years, and their interest rates are always 6 to 7%. The ones for multilateral loans are always 1 to 2%. So that's always the difference, and that's why maybe Kenya is finding itself in some debt distress. And yeah, the third point that is slightly tied to the debt issue is the cost of living. So this one, again, I'm guessing it's a global thing, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic and also the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I've been seeing, for instance, in so many European countries, like in Germany, like the inflation rate went really high. And even I think in the UK, the inflation rate for the first time hit 10%, and it's still quite high. I don't know what the situation is in Spain currently, but the cost of living is really high. And so because the government is also under an IMF program, the current government, which was elected and came into power last year, August, so they've been in power for like 1 year and a couple of months. They introduced a raft of new taxes at the beginning of the financial year in June this year. And they have been so controversial. So many people are against the new taxes. And one of the things, of course, is Kenya is still a country that also struggles with corruption, as so many African countries. And for that reason, people are like, we don't mind paying the taxes as long as they do their job. But the problem is, if somebody raises the taxes and you have to pay more taxes, but then a huge amount of it disappears in the pockets of politicians, then it's something that people really find annoying. And so many people have been against the new taxes being introduced by the new government. But then the cost of living has been going up a little bit, and Kenya is also like also a country that is, it has various geographical regions. And the funny thing is that Kenya, 2/3 of the territory of Kenya are arid and semi-arid. So that will be, I think, like in southern Spain, where it's almost like a desert kind of area. So the northern part of Kenya is always like that. So there are places always faced with drought and famine. And if a lot of the agriculture being done in Kenya, agriculture is like the biggest industry in Kenya, contributes to about 21% of the GDP directly. And most of it is rain-fed. So people depend on the rain. The rains will rain in March, and then they plant in April. And they harvest in June, July. That's maize and beans. And sometimes in October, November, they are the short rains. So the first ones were the long rains. In September, October, November, the short rains, people still do a little bit of planting. But the problem is, if the rains miss even by 2 weeks or 1 month, then it really affects the harvest. So I think those are the two other points that I wanted to mention regarding the situation of the country. So I don't know, maybe let me pause for a moment if there are any questions.
Yeah, well, I have a question, yeah. So what is your opinion on the increased Chinese investment in Kenya? Like, do you believe that benefits Kenyans? Why does it? Why not? What is your opinion on Chinese investments?
So my opinion about Chinese investments is that it's a really positive thing. Most Western countries have been investing they don't invest a lot in Kenya, in African countries. And most Western countries actually do more of what is known as development cooperation, so like foreign aid or aid assistance. So if you guys need help in development projects, building a school, building a hospital, if you guys need a lot of support in building institutions, like in governance, that is what most Western countries always do on the African continent. And they've been doing it like since independence. And once in a while, they do infrastructure projects like roads and bridges and hydroelectric power dams and geothermal power plants. But most of the time, Western countries shy away from infrastructure projects. So they do a lot of general development cooperation, building of schools and hospitals. but they also do a lot of trainings, capacity building, and all that. Now, the difference is the Chinese, when they came to Africa, they merely focused on one thing: infrastructure. It was building of roads, building of bridges, building of railways, and also like they do a lot in building of dams and hydroelectric power plants, etc. And that is an area that had been neglected for a long time. So the fact that the Chinese focused on that one area, which the Western countries were not really doing, I think it's a really positive thing. So of course, there have been some challenges. China has been accused of carrying out debt trap diplomacy, which means they give many African countries so much debt, knowing those countries will not be able to pay them, and then they ask them to provide collateral, like their ports, their airports, to become collateral, so that it's a way of entrapping them, so that the Chinese can get those ports and everything. So that narrative was quite common over the past 5-10 years, but actually it has been debunked a couple of times. Maybe you guys might know the British think tank called Chatham House in London. It even did a study, I think 2 years ago, and it discovered that a lot of it was basically, you can say, propaganda. China was not here to trap anybody. However, the Chinese probably made certain mistakes when they were coming to African countries. They assumed that, let's say, they have a very strong stance on corruption in their country. So they assumed that the same stance on corruption applies to Kenya, to Sierra Leone, to Nigeria, which wasn't the truth. So in as much as they are giving these loans and they're also coming to build the rail and the roads, so many of the leaders in Africa and their ministers, etc., they were engaged in some corruption. And so you find that the overall efficiency of the project is not where maybe the Chinese expected it to be. So it's true they've built the rail, but the rail is not performing as much as it was supposed to perform, because there are also certain domestic issues like corruption and a lot of competition between Kenyan people in the Kenyan government, and everybody wants to have their hand in the cookie jar. And so that aspect is what many people say China greatly underestimated. But in overall sense, I think Chinese investment, especially in infrastructure, is a good thing, not only in Kenya, but across the entire African continent.
Any more questions? Yeah, Kevin.
So, hello, Mr. I
Hi.
would ask you that your opinion about that the predominant GPTs are from the capital Nairobi, and the majority of GPT came from the agriculture sector. How do you think Kenya should transition in that, or to a more manufacturing, or to a more like spinning, clothing, to the second sector of production?
Yeah, so that's an issue that has been facing Kenya for quite some time, and actually it has been going even in reverse gear, because I think in 2008 to 2010, the manufacturing sector was contributing about 12-13% to Kenya's GDP, and since 2013 it has been going down drastically. So from 13% right now is currently at around 7.5%. And agriculture is used to be, I think, 25-26%. It has also gone down a little bit to 21%. And the service industry is the one that is actually on the upward motion. So you're talking about hotel and tourism and bars and restaurants, etc. And also banking and insurance. So to your question, Kenya should actually work much more harder to try and increase the amount of manufacturing capacity, because as I mentioned earlier, Kenya is a lower middle income country, and the next stage of development should be upper middle income, and then hopefully one day high income countries, which are like industrial countries like Spain, like the US, Japan, China currently. So Kenya should be moving more towards promoting more manufacturing. Now, so many people in the manufacturing industry, they complain that there are so many taxes. There is a lot of tax lack of tax predictability. So the government decides this year we are increasing taxes, next year we are reducing taxes. And people in the manufacturing sector, the companies and the industries, they are saying we need something that is much more predictable so that we can be able to increase our output ourselves. So the other point about manufacturing is also about attracting foreign direct investment. Kenya is not doing really well in terms of attracting foreign companies that can come into the country and do manufacturing. Most of the companies coming into Kenya are coming in the service sector. So I mentioned about hotels, tourism. And of recent, we have most of these big tech, big data, big social media companies, especially from the US. So you're talking about Meta, Facebook, Google. They have all established regional hubs in Nairobi, but still it's in the service sector. They're not manufacturing anything. So a lot of the foreign direct investment coming is not coming into the manufacturing sector. And one of the reasons they will say is, once again, the topics that even the local companies cry about: a lot of taxes. The cost of electricity is slightly higher in Kenya compared to the countries in the region. And so that makes Kenya not a very attractive country for manufacturing FDI. But yeah, I mean, it's a good point. The only way for Kenya to move one step up from lower middle income country to upper middle income countries to increase the amount of manufacturing contribution to the GDP.
Thank you, sir. And do you consider the fast developing of banking system and such as real estate or exporting have made the local people's life, well, does it create more class struggle in Nairobi, especially some who live there? They have a high expense to live there due to the fast development of those sectors and for foreign companies.
Sure. I mean, I won't categorize it as class struggles, but of course, as with many developing countries, there's a lot of inequality in Nairobi as the capital city, and I also mentioned it's like the diplomatic hub in the region and also the economic and international hub. So you already see it, especially in real estate, because there's so many expats, but also so many rich Kenyans. They live in very specific neighborhoods. So I mentioned also like the United Nations, the only office in the Southern Hemisphere is in Nairobi. So in that area where the United Nations is located is also like the diplomatic hub. And I think 80% of all embassies are located in that area. And so it means the cost of living, of real estate in that area is extremely high, which means inequality is a real issue. And then Kenya, Nairobi is also, sometimes you can say it's a tale of two cities, because you also have, I think, probably the largest informal settlement, the slums, in Africa is in Nairobi, called Kibera. And so it shows the two sides of Nairobi. It's true, it's a diplomatic hub, it's a technological hub in the region and all that. But on the flip side, and so there are so many people who are doing quite well in the services, in the real estate, but on the flip side, there are also so many people who are living still in very poor conditions, in slums, in shacks, and most of them are day laborers. Like they simply wake up, go out and look for work. Like they are not assured of any job. So they'll only go there and maybe get work for a couple of hours, maybe they get work for one day, and then they get paid in the evening and they go and buy food with it, maybe buy some stuff for their children, let's say uniform, pencil, a book, and then the next day they have to basically once again go out to go and get paid on a daily manner. So it's always called hand to mouth, living hand to mouth, because all the money that you get, you spend it mostly for food. Most can't even afford like the public transport, so they have to walk to work. And so from time to time you have these inequality struggles, which maybe you can categorize as a class struggle, the way you're mentioning. But that's something that also affects not only Nairobi, but also the entire country. And I'm also thinking the entire continent.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Last question.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, is the Kenya government publishing any policies for local entrepreneurs for establish the local company for Kenyans rather than attracting foreign companies to come to Kenya and establish a greater economy? Is the government willing to construct some like superpowers in Kenya?
I mean, when they're campaigning for elections, they always say that. So I think that's of course something that happens all over the world. I'm even imagining in Barcelona when there are regional elections in Catalonia, or I don't know, the mayoral elections. The mayor over there says, hey, we'll do this and that and that and that. But once they get elected and they come into office, then they start saying, yeah, but we have to deal with this and that and that and that, and so we'll do that one much later. So, and I think you guys in Spain just had elections quite recently, even though they were not, a government hasn't been formed yet, I think, or something of the sort. So they do that also in Kenya, and the government says, and I just told you we had elections last year, August, and the government says, the candidates say, yeah, I'll do this, I'll do that. And the candidate who actually won, the current president, William Ruto, he actually campaigned on a platform of inequality. So he was saying he's coming from the hustlers, like people, just the regular strugglers, somebody who's trying to make a money. You have to be creative, you have to be street smart. And he was saying the other candidate is from a dynasty because his dad was the first vice president in the 60s, etc. And he actually won the election, and he had promised to establish something called the Hustler Fund. The Hustler Fund was a kind of government loans that you give to people who are the bottom rung of the economy, and then they can use it to boost their own businesses. So local small businesses, small enterprises, but also local investors. But then the amount that was being given was way too little, and many people are arguing it won't even help people. And there was a lot of hype when it was started last year, December, but by May, June of this year, like the hype completely dissipated. So it's true, the government publishes so many policies, papers, they make so many promises, but once they get into power, you start just hearing there's a new corruption scandal, or they're spending money on things that people are like, for instance, like just on food, like on breakfast, people spend so much money in government offices buying the best kinds of breakfast, high quality coffee, and how can I call them? Like they're called samosas or mandazis or something of the sort, and like specialty kind of things. And you would argue, I mean, why don't you do that in your home in the morning? Bring your own coffee from your house so that you can drink it in the office. But in Kenya, and I think in many African countries, people say, no, that has to be paid for by the government. I'm working for the government. So that's the situation that is facing small businesses and even local investors.
Thank you for your explanation, Mr.
Okay, I think it's good if we give the floor to Ilya, because he's been there with his hand raised for like the past 15 minutes. So go ahead, Ilya.
Don't worry. Well, my question was about the government spending. So you mentioned the Kenya has to increase manufacturing. Does the government subsidize that in any way? Well, maybe. Well,
not really, and that's like one of the things that annoys so many people in manufacturing, because it's known the world over, like manufacturing creates so many jobs. Like if you open a factory, let's say Kenya is a major agricultural country. So I've just mentioned that 21% of the GDP is from agriculture. And I think currently Kenya is the second largest exporter of tea. And in the 90s and 80s, Kenya was the second or the third largest exporter of coffee. The problem is most of it doesn't undergo value addition. Like it's just coffee or tea straight from the farm. It's dried and then it's exported to, for instance, Europe. For instance, Switzerland is well known for roasting most of the coffee that comes from Kenya and Ethiopia. And so the lack of value addition means it only creates jobs in the farm and in the export logistics, transporting it to the port or to the airport, and then it's transported out. So many people have been complaining to the government and saying the government should subsidize and even provide incentives for manufacturing. It can even ask local investors, not necessarily international ones, even local ones. We give you land, we give you electricity at half the price, and we provide you with water. Please establish a factory here which will take the coffee, dry the coffee, and then roast the coffee. And then that coffee can be sold to Starbucks or Nestle or the major global companies that deal with some of these raw products. When that doesn't happen, it means the roasting and the further processing will happen in Europe, will happen in the US, and so many jobs won't be created here locally. So people, for instance, there's an organization called Kenya Association of Manufacturers, KAM, and another one called KEPSA, Kenya Private Sector Alliance. They meet with government officials, the Ministry of Trade and Industry. During the campaigns, they met with both leading candidates and they explained all the issues that they hope can be resolved. And once again, because of politics, the candidates say, yeah, we will do this, we will increase manufacturing to 20%, we will provide subsidies, everything. Once they come into power, the story changes.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, now Isabel, your question.
So on the subject of like candidates making promises they can't really commit on, is populism very abundant in like Africa or Kenya? Because I know that in Latin America, many candidates for like politics make like promises like I'm gonna make the poor people more rich or I'm gonna create equality, but like at the end they try to appeal to the grand majority but never really actually do anything. So does that also happen there?
Populism, I think, is something that is in abundance, or it's in plenty all over the world. So it's not only in Latin America, it's also in Africa. And I like when I was studying in Germany, like I stayed in Germany for 4 years between 2016 and 2020. And populism, you guys probably already know it. Populism is also a major thing in Europe. And also like in the United States with Donald Trump and all that. So yeah, unfortunately, populism is everywhere, including in Kenya. And in Kenya, sometimes people make the joke that politicians will tell you, I will build a tarmac road, a paved road like with asphalt. I will build a tarmac road up to your doorstep. And for that one, they are telling people who live in the rural area. So I mean, in Nairobi, yeah, I mean, there are modern apartments. You can say people just live next to the road. But in rural areas where people have dirt roads, etc., somebody tells you, yeah, I'll make a paved road which stops at your doorstep, which is an impossibility. But they still do it, and unfortunately, so many people vote for them. And once they come into office, they forget the people who voted for them. And then 5 years later, they'll come back once again with the same populist rhetoric, and people will just vote for them again. That's the unfortunate situation that is quite common in Kenya, but also in Africa, and I think in so many other parts of the world.
Well, thank you for the question, Isabel. Yeah, Ilya, you have another question.
Sorry. Well, my other question is, which industry do you think is like growing the most right now in Kenya? Like you, because you mentioned like a few agriculture, for example, or the technology with the companies like Google coming to Kenya more and more. Which one do you think the more like the grows the most right now?
So I think I also mentioned it in passing. The service industry is actually the fastest growing in Kenya, and it has been growing so fast because it's interesting because I've read a couple of reports and studies that say service industry provides more jobs than even manufacturing, which is also interesting. I mean, manufacturing has been known to be the hub of jobs, but apparently service industry provides more jobs than even manufacturing. And so the service industry in Kenya has been continuing to grow. And I mean, service industry is quite wide. So the basic ones that I mentioned are hotel, uh, hotels, restaurants, and tourism. So logistics companies that take people to national parks, and the hotels that are located in national parks, as well as those ones which are also located in urban areas. So that is always the basic part of services industry. But then banking and insurance are also part of the service industry. And so many, Kenya has, I think, 40 banks and so many insurance companies. So banking and insurance is something that still continues to grow. And then you can talk about the digital sector. So of course you remember the ones I mentioned: Google and Meta, Facebook. In fact, for Meta, the content moderation that they've been doing a lot, especially on the African continent, is always done from Nairobi by young Kenyans. I mean, Kenya has a very young, tech-savvy and digitally skilled population, and so many young Kenyans have been doing content moderation for Facebook and for Instagram. And recently, I think at the beginning of the year, there was even a court case. The Kenyans took Meta to court because some of them were doing content moderation on very graphic stuff, especially during, I don't know if you guys know, in 2020, towards the end, while COVID was raging, there was a civil war taking place in Ethiopia, which borders Kenya on the north, and the civil war in the Tigray region. And so much stuff was being posted online. It's almost like Ukraine, or you can talk about the conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict currently. And of course, you guys know from Facebook and Instagram, they always have this content moderation. They want to know, is the content so graphic, somebody being killed, somebody being injured also. And so like the people who are doing the content moderation, especially on the African continent, were Kenyans. But then they were claiming they were not getting any emotional support, any therapy afterwards. So many of them were like really depressed. So, but yeah, that's one of the sectors. The digital sector is really growing fast as part of the services sector. So the sector that is growing the fastest in Kenya, I would say, is the services sector, with all the different sectors, with all the different subsectors under it, whether it's hotel, tourism, whether it's bars and restaurants, whether it's banking and insurance, and whether it's also the digital sector.
Okay, thank you. And can I ask one more question really quick?
Sure.
I would like to ask a question about the relations with Kenyan neighbors, let's say. The countries around Kenya, there's a lot of different countries. Do the relations between Kenya and those countries affect the Kenyan economy? Like maybe the different people crossing the border, the exchange of young talents between the countries, does that influence? Or?
I think so. I think it influences. As I had earlier mentioned, most of the countries, Kenya, I think, borders 6 countries. And of those, most of them are in the East African community, which is our regional, which is our small EU, basically. So Kenya, there are so many young people who come to Kenya because, as I also mentioned, Kenya is the only lower middle income country. So all the other countries are least developed countries. So LDCs versus LMICs. So many young East Africans, they cross over to Kenya to work. And it also brings in a lot of interaction. And also so many Kenyans who are well educated in the services sector, in teaching, they also go to those countries to teach and to work. So there's a very nice mix or balance of interaction between Kenya and its neighbors. And this also affects the economy because Kenya's two largest trading partners usually are Uganda and Tanzania, which are our neighbors. And from time to time, the United States is always one of our largest trading partner, as well as the European Union combined, and then the Netherlands, which is part of the European Union, and maybe from time to time also the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, so where Dubai is. So Tanzania and Uganda are always in the top 5 trading partners for Kenya. And because they are our neighbors, so a lot of this stuff do actually impact the Kenyan economy.
Thank you. Understood.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, are there any more questions in the room? Because in that case, I've got one last question. We are going a little over time, but it's really brief. So
No worries.
Just to ask you, would you say that Kenya is one of the strongest democracies in Africa? If so, why or why not? And do you believe Kenya sets a good example for other African countries that are less developed to pursue, essentially?
So by most metrics, yes, Kenya is one of the strongest democracies on the African continent. Most people always put Kenya on the same rank with Ghana and Botswana and maybe Namibia, which these are the countries that are always listed as some of the most democratic on the continent. And so I think Kenya is quite democratic. And you asked why. I would mention one thing that I think sets Kenya apart, the democratic space, especially the freedom of the media and the right to express yourself. So for instance, just in the region, we have so many presidents, you can't criticize them. You write a social media post, a Facebook post or a tweet that talks in a negative way about the president, and the next day you get arrested. In Kenya, I already told you guys, Kenya is has a lot of tech-savvy, digitally skilled young people. And Kenya also has one of the highest penetration of smartphones. I think 65% on the African continent. And I think that is in the top 3. So it means most Kenyans have a smartphone and they go on Twitter and TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, and they will air their opinions as they see fit. And for that reason, the former president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, he was in power between 2013 and 2022. He left power last year. He closed his Twitter account in 2018. And the reason he said was because he was always being insulted every single day by Kenyans. Like they will just tag the president and call him names. So for him, he was like, I even left Twitter because I was being insulted so much. So, and in many countries, actually in Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, in Rwanda, Paul Kagame, you criticize the president, you end up in jail. And unfortunately, that is the situation in so many African countries. But I think countries like Ghana, Botswana, you can do that. Senegal used to be like also one of the rising democracies until I think the last year when one of the opposition candidates has been in prison for a couple of people think trumped up charges. But I think one of the key indications for me for telling a strong democracy is basically the freedom of the media and the right to express yourself freely. But of course, elections is also another one, and Kenya has had regular democratic elections ever since 1992. They are always contentious. In 2008, there was a little post-election violence, and in the past elections, even this past one, it was contested. The opposition candidate refused to accept the results, and it went to the Supreme Court. But the good thing is the Supreme Court decides, and then people have to live by that ruling. And there are also term limits for the president. Like you can only run for office for only 2 terms as a president, and each term is 5 years. So that actually ensures that you don't have the dictators that you have in so many African countries, somebody who they've abolished the term limits and they are running for, they have been in power for 20, 30, 40 years, which is quite common in Africa. In Kenya, you can only be in power for 10 years since 1992. So I would say media freedom, right of expression, regular periodic elections, and presidential term limits actually make Kenya one of the strongest democracies on the African continent. I've forgotten the second part of the question, sorry.
I believe you've answered everything. I think the second part of the question was kind of like similar to the first, because I didn't write that part down, so I don't really.
Yeah, you talked about, do you think Kenya should be a good example to other African countries?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that was the second part of the question. Yeah, I think Kenya can be a very good example to many African countries. Not in everything, of course. Kenya has, I mentioned a lot of issues with corruption. So corruption is definitely not a good thing that you can tell other African countries, even though you might find that most of those African countries even have much deeper corruption problems than Kenya. But for many things, I think Kenya can be a very good role model to many other African countries, yes.
Okay, thank you for answering my questions. Having said this, does anyone else in the room have any questions to ask our guest speaker? Okay, I will take that as a no. So I believe this is a wrap. Thank you so much, Pius, for being here at the Young Politicians Convention and sharing your insights on Kenyan politics. It has been a pleasure. Okay, any other question?
No, it's not a question. I just wanted to say thank you for the information that you gave us. It was really interesting and was really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, let's just everyone turn your mics on and let's give a round of applause to our guest speaker. After that.
Okay, I just want to say thank you guys for inviting me. Ilya has already said it was interesting information. I really hoped it wasn't boring or something that made you guys feel sleepy or so. And I wish you all guys luck with your studies and your future careers and everything.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone.
And maybe once you guys finish school, etc., you can even visit Nairobi, Kenya. Kenya is a very popular country with so many relatives, with so many tourists. So maybe you can consider Kenya as one of a place that you can visit. You can do your internships, etc.
Perhaps we'll organize some trip for the YPolCon members at some point, perhaps next year. That would be interesting. Anyhow,
okay.
Thanks everyone, and that's a wrap. Bye.
Okay, bye. Buenas noches. Buenas noches.
Wow.